Historical villains who were actually good people. The way we judge historical figures often comes from biased stories. Let's take a closer look at historically so-called villains who were actually good people. Marie Antoinette. When people think of evil people in history, Marie Antoinette usually shows up with a fancy wig and a pastry tray. Born an Archduchess of Austria, she was married off at just 14 to Louis Auguste of France, who later became King Louis XVI. This marriage wasn't about love or teenage romance, it was a political chess move to keep Austria and France friendly. By the time she was 19, she was sitting on the throne as Queen of France, dazzling everyone with her looks and charm. But her popularity faded quickly as rumors and gossip began to spread. Her reputation spiraled fast. People called her Madame Deficit, blaming her shopping habits for France's massive financial meltdown, the famous "let them eat cake" line. Supposedly, her cold response to hearing peasants had no bread got pinned on her, even though the phrase had been around long before she arrived at Versailles and wasn't actually hers. To the struggling French public, she became the poster child for a spoiled elite who couldn't care less about starving peasants. By the Revolution, she was accused of everything from bankrupting the country to seducing her brother to plotting against France itself. But none of that held up under real evidence. Most historians today argue she was more scapegoat than villain. France's money problems came from endless wars, not just gowns and jewels. Her trial was a total setup, with fake charges that made sure she would be found guilty. Private letters show a woman trying to be a loving mother, offering clumsy advice to her husband and occasionally giving to the poor. She wasn't a saint, but the heartless queen image was more propaganda than truth. In the end, Marie Antoinette looks less like a monster and more like someone trapped in the wrong place at the worst possible time. Now, this time in China, where one of history's most powerful women has long been painted as a villain but deserves another look. Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon was born on the island of Corsica in 1769, just after it became part of France. He rose from a military academy student to one of the most famous generals in Europe, seizing opportunity during the chaos of the French Revolution. By his mid-20s, victories in Italy turned him into a national hero. In 1799, he carried out a coup known as the 18th Brumaire, pushing aside the old government and making himself first consul. Only a few years later, in 1804, he crowned himself Emperor of the French, signaling that he owed his power to no pope or king. Over the next decade, he built a European empire through the series of conflicts we call the Napoleonic Wars. Critics then and now describe him as a warmonger who dragged Europe into endless bloodshed for his own glory. He dismantled the revolution's early democratic gains and concentrated power in himself. His government censored opposition, and his disastrous invasion of Russia in 1812 left massive suffering in its wake. British propaganda painted him as a monster, and the wars connected to his campaigns caused millions of deaths. Supporters, however, point to a very different side. Napoleon introduced the Napoleonic Code, a legal system that still influences law in many countries today. He promoted merit over birth, allowing talented people to rise in government and the army. He stabilized France's finances, established public schools, supported science, and struck a balance with the Catholic Church while allowing religious freedom for others. Many historians argue that some of his wars were defensive, launched against coalitions determined to crush revolutionary France. Even his soldiers adored him, remembering his charisma and personal bravery, and this is why his legacy remains so divided. For some, Napoleon was a tyrant who left Europe soaked in blood. For others, he was a revolutionary statesman whose reforms shaped the modern world in ways that lasted long after his fall. Now, let's jump across the ocean to the American Wild West, where the next so-called villain became one of the most famous outlaws in history, Billy the Kid. Billy the Kid is one of the most famous names from the Wild West, often remembered as a ruthless outlaw. His reputation exploded during the Lincoln County War of 1878, a bloody feud in New Mexico, where Billy fought with a group called the Regulators to avenge their murdered employer. He became known as a skilled gunman who could slip out of jail again and again. Reports of how many people he killed vary widely. Most say 4 to 8, but newspapers inflated it to 21, one for every year of his short life. So why did people call him a villain? The press painted him as the very symbol of frontier lawlessness, a cold-blooded killer who who made the West unsafe. With a bounty on his head, he became the hunted outlaw in every dime novel and headline. But Billy's real story feels less like a monster tale and more like a tragedy. Many locals saw him as a defender of the underdog, taking on corrupt cattle barons. Historians now say his body count was exaggerated and that most of his shootings happened in self-defense or in the chaos of that feud. Friends also described him as funny, generous, and even charming, not the merciless gunfighter of legend. And when Sheriff Pat Garrett finally tracked him down and killed him in 1881, Billy was only 21 himself, still more kid than hardened criminal. In the end, Billy the Kid became less a villain and more a folk hero, a symbol of resistance in a rough world where survival often looked a lot like crime. Let's now head over to Italy for the next so-called villain, a figure whose name has been wrapped up in poison, scandal, and endless gossip for centuries. And hey, before we dive in, if you're enjoying these surprising flips of history, now's the perfect time to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the next twist. Lucrezia Borgia. If you've heard the name Borgia, you probably think of poison, backstabbing, and every kind of scandal under the Renaissance sun. Lucrezia Borgia was born in Italy as the daughter of Rodrigo Borgia, who later became Pope Alexander VI. That made her part of one of the most infamous families in European history, the Borgias, so notorious that their name became shorthand for corruption and intrigue. From the start, Lucrezia's life wasn't really her own. Her powerful father and her ruthless brother Cesare Borgia used her like a bargaining chip, marrying her off 3 times to secure alliances. Those marriages tell the story of her early life. Her first, to Giovanni Sforza, ended in annulment. Her second, to Alfonso of Aragon, ended in murder. Many blamed Cesare for that one. Finally, she married Alfonso d'Este, Duke of Ferrara. This last match gave her stability and a chance to build her own reputation. In Ferrara, she gained respect as a duchess, known for her intelligence, charity, and support of the arts. So, why did history brand her a villain? Stories claimed she carried a ring that could secretly release poison, perfect for slipping into an enemy's drink. Even worse were the rumors that she was romantically involved with her father and her brother. Chroniclers of the time even painted her as a schemer, suggesting she was deeply involved in her family's ruthless politics and willing to plot alongside them. But the evidence doesn't hold up. Historians today say those tales of poison and incest were mostly propaganda pushed by the Borgias' enemies. In reality, Lucrezia was more pawn than puppet master, especially in her youth. In Ferrara, she became beloved for her kindness, diplomacy, and cultural patronage. She supported poets, painters, and religious institutions, and her later life showed a woman deeply devoted to her faith. When you cut through the centuries of rumor, Lucrezia looks like a woman caught in the shadow of her family's reputation, who managed to carve out her own legacy of respect and generosity. Next, we'll head back across the Atlantic to Renaissance Italy to meet a thinker whose name turned into a synonym for scheming, even though the real man was far more complicated. Niccolò Machiavelli. If you've ever heard someone called Machiavellian, you know it's not a compliment. The word brings to mind scheming politicians who'll do anything to get ahead. That reputation traces back to Niccolò Machiavelli, a Florentine diplomat and writer from Italy in the late 1400s and early 1500s. Machiavelli spent much of his career serving the Republic of Florence, working as a civil servant and envoy to some of the most powerful rulers of the day, including the infamous Cesare Borgia. Machiavelli's rise in politics began in 1498 after the powerful Medici family was pushed out of Florence. He built a name for himself as a clever diplomat and even helped organize Florence's military. But his career collapsed when the Medici family, one of the wealthiest and most powerful dynasties in Italy, clawed their way back into power in 1512. Accused of conspiracy, he was arrested, tortured, and exiled from politics. It was during that exile that he wrote his most famous work, The Prince. That book became the reason so many people saw Machiavelli as a villain. The Prince reads like a no-nonsense guide for rulers, suggesting they use deceit, manipulation, and even cruelty if necessary to hold power. Critics pounced, claiming he was teaching leaders how to be tyrants. His name turned into shorthand for scheming, and Machiavellian became an insult that stuck for centuries. Shakespeare and others also added fuel to the fire, portraying him as the father of political evil. But here's the catch. Machiavelli wasn't the monster his reputation suggests. In his other writings, like Discourses on Livy, he praised republican government and civic virtue. Many historians believe the prince wasn't a celebration of tyranny, but a blunt look at how politics really worked in Renaissance Italy. Far from cheering on cruelty, he might have been exposing it. On top of that, Machiavelli pushed for citizen militias instead of mercenary armies, which often exploited the states they served. And in his personal life, accounts describe him as witty, sociable, and fiercely loyal to Florence. His unfair legacy came less from his own words and more from how later generations twisted them. As we close in on the end of our journey, let's move to our final story. Someone remembered for centuries as a ruthless villain, yet whose real story takes a very different turn. Richard III. Richard III is remembered as one of England's most notorious kings, accused of killing his own young nephews to steal the throne. In 1483, after his brother King Edward IV died, Richard was supposed to protect his 12-year-old nephew, Edward V. Instead, he declared the boy and his siblings illegitimate, locked the two princes in the Tower of London, and took the crown for himself. The princes disappeared soon after, never seen again, and Richard's name was forever linked to their fate. His reign lasted just 2 years before he was killed in battle by Henry Tudor, who went on to start the famous Tudor dynasty. The disappearance of the princes became the cornerstone of his villain status, and Shakespeare later doubled down by turning him into a crooked-backed tyrant in his play Richard III. The Tudors had every reason to spread that image too, since it made their new dynasty look like saviors. But in the north of England, Richard was respected for fair governance and even pushed reforms like bail instead of endless pre-trial jail time. He also ordered laws to be written in English rather than Latin so ordinary people could understand them. There's still no clear proof he killed the princes, and historians continue to debate the case. What is certain is that Richard died fighting bravely, the last English king to fall in battle. Far from being a cartoon villain, he looks more like a capable ruler whose reputation was destroyed by enemies who outlived him. And this brings us to the end of our journey through history's so-called villains. Turns out a lot of them were way more complicated than the scary legends make them sound. Thanks for hanging out, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you can catch the next round of wild stories from the past.